because metacognition creates a space. In that space is where choice exists. Until we think about it, until we see it as a choice, it's not. And we'll roll with whatever our programming is.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. My 10-year-old daughter has a very sweet temperament. When I leave for work each day, she's usually the last to say goodbye to me, and when I come home, she's usually the first to greet me with enthusiasm. I gotta admit though, sometimes I've been annoyed by the way she hugs me. She clings on tight while I'm trying to get my shoes on, or insists on seeing me off, sometimes holding me back from leaving. But then the other day, I realized that one day I might miss this part of our relationship when she grows out of it. Instead of looking at it as an annoyance, I can choose to look at it a little different, like as if this is something endearing. Choosing to look at it a little differently has changed my relationship with her most of the time. Our mindset and patterns of thinking make a huge difference in our intimate relationships and our ability to grow sexually as a couple. As they say, our brains are our biggest and most important sex organ. How you think about sex, your relationship, and your attitude about your relationship makes a big impact on your ability to connect emotionally, spiritually, and sexually. My guest today is Dr. Paul Jenkins. He's a clinical psychologist and expert in the field of positive psychology. I interviewed him on what positive psychology is and how to live a more abundant life and a marriage because of it. Speaking of building an abundant life in marriage, if you haven't heard, we've announced a fun and exciting virtual marriage retreat. This is the kind of retreat where you and your spouse get a hotel together or send the kids to grandma's house for the weekend, and you join us live via Zoom webinar. This is on June 9th and 10th, which is a Friday and Saturday. Emily and I will guide you and your spouse through specific practices and exercises designed to draw you two closer together sexually. It's all about passion, pleasure, and deep connection. Experience something new with your spouse in a way that you'll both enjoy. You can sign up for this at getyourmarriageon.com, click on retreat, and then choose virtual retreat. And now on to the interview. Dr. Paul Jenkins, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Dan. This is exciting for me.
This is good. So you're a positivity psychologist. Have you always been positive?
A lot of people don't even know what that is, but we've got to get past the trite, fluffy, just think positive that you hear sometimes from motivational speakers or gurus on the stage, because life happens.
Right.
And sometimes it's extremely difficult. So we're not talking about ignoring the painful stuff.
Or being Pollyanna-ish about everything.
Well, I used to think that, people used to accuse me of being Pollyanna-ish.
All right.
Okay? And I'm thinking, is that a compliment? I don't even know. And then I went and read the story. Okay. If you get past even the Disney film about Pollyanna into the story behind it, this is a young 11-year-old girl who was orphaned. And at 11, you're old enough to know what's going on. Sometimes lightning strikes in your life. For Pollyanna, she lost both of her parents.
And she's living with an aunt that doesn't love her.
Who is not particularly positive. Right? This is not an ideal situation. I had a similar experience myself. In fact, my book starts with a chapter titled Lightning Strikes. And this was my Pollyanna experience, where the floor just falls out. For me, it was a bankruptcy.
Okay.
And I remember thinking at the time, Dan, this is bad. This is hard. This is difficult. This is painful. This is frustrating. You get where I'm going with this.
Yes.
And when something like this happens, whether it's a bankruptcy or your parents both die like Pollyanna's did, or you go through a divorce or you get a diagnosis or whatever it is. And at the time, Dan, I was going with a youth group. My wife and I had volunteered to help lead a youth group on a pioneer reenactment track.
Yes. I've been on
Okay.
those.
Some of the early Western pioneers, right? And so we're out there with hand carts and trying to reenact what these early pioneers experienced. Well, as part of that adventure, we did a little bit of research into our own family history. And I discovered a family, my ancestors, who came across the plains in one of those early pioneer treks.
All right.
So they get on a boat in England in 1856 with their 6 children. 2 days later, they have 7 children. Okay, you with
Uh-huh.
me?
Uh-huh.
Man, these are not luxury cruise liners in
Uh-uh.
1856.
Uh-uh.
Okay, so they have a baby on the ship. So if you can picture this little family, big family actually, 7 kids, and they join up with a company called the Willie Handcart Company. You guys can go Google that if you want to. This was an ill-fated group that ran into some early winter storms in Wyoming, and like half of them died. They're burying people every morning
Or trying to bury because its ground is frozen. They
because it's
can't really bury them.
frozen.
Uh-huh.
Right? Kick some snow over them and go on.
Uh-huh.
I mean, not
Uh-huh.
to sound insensitive about that, but this was their life. This was their reality. And it dawned on me, Dan, as I'm going through this bankruptcy and I'm thinking, oh, I'm having such a hard time. And then I'm like, really? Compared to what? I'm not dragging my babies across the plains of Wyoming in winter storms. I know where we're sleeping tonight. I know what we're eating tomorrow. And it dawned on me that the problem wasn't my bankruptcy. The problem was my thinking about my bankruptcy.
Gotcha. Yes.
And some lights went on for me that moved on to developing an entire model around what positivity actually is. So my job is to illuminate the obvious, which
Gotcha.
is cool because I get paid to tell people things they already know. But Dan, there's obvious things that are completely unnoticed. I did not notice that I was judging my own circumstances so harshly. Until I learned about the Moulton family and their 7 children coming across the plains, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
then and it's like, oh, the lights go on. See, a lot of what's going on in our mind is in that space. It's obvious, but unnoticed until it's called to your attention. Like the feeling of your shirt. Can you
Uh-huh.
feel it? Now,
Yeah. Yeah, now that you say so. Uh-huh.
and it's obvious, right?
Uh-huh.
But it was totally unnoticed until I called it to your attention. Or the fact that we're speaking English. Did you notice?
No.
Obvious.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Now, and most of what's going on in our own mind is in that space.
That makes sense.
So a positivity psychologist, I mean, I call myself that because what I do is illuminate the obvious about processes that are going on in your own mind that are completely obvious, but completely unnoticed until they're called to your attention.
Gotcha.
So, and that's a fun space. You work with a lot of couples, and people will come in and tell me if you've experienced this. I mean, they come in and they feel trapped, they feel stuck,
Yes.
and they think that this is their reality when in actuality it's their thought processes, but they don't see it. And until we see it, it's not a choice.
Yeah, let's talk about choice and agency in all of this. Like, can you talk on the way thoughts are different than circumstances?
Well, circumstances are neutral.
What's an
Now,
example?
I
Of
get fired for that. Because they're like, my circumstances are neutral. Mine are. We all get to think sometimes that our circumstances are extraordinary. But when I say circumstances are neutral, all I mean is that it could always be worse.
Okay.
And
It could
it
always be
should
better
always
too.
be better.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Now, is that true? Because, dear listeners, I don't want you to take my word for this. I want you to run it through your own filters and see if that's true. Because no matter how bad things seem, in my bankruptcy, I was thinking it can't get any worse than this. I honestly remember thinking this is really, really bad. But check it out. It's only really bad compared to something better.
Right, right.
Because
Uh-huh.
when I compare it to, babies dying on the trail, I'm like, I'll take this, thank you.
Right. Uh-huh.
So here's the part that I want you to notice. And this involves a process called metacognition.
Okay. What does that mean?
Okay, that's just a fancy psychobabble word. We make up words in psychology. It makes us feel smart.
And you gotta
Me-
justify your income, right?
Absolutely. Got a PhD freaking D, right? Yeah. And cognition means thinking. Metacognition is a higher level. It's thinking about thinking.
Gotcha. Uh-huh. That's
Now,
a unique trait, right? Like,
yes, I
uh,
think so. I mean, I haven't interviewed a lot of baboons, but as far as we know, this is uniquely human, and this is what sets us apart from all the other species. And notice right in this moment, this is obvious but unnoticed, okay, until it's called to your attention, that you can think about your thinking.
yes.
This is huge because metacognition creates a space. In that space is where choice
Mhm.
exists.
That sounds like a Viktor Frankl quote. It's one of his from Man's Search for Meaning. He talks about that
Yeah.
a lot. Uh-huh.
He specifically tied it to between stimulus and response, there's
Right.
this little space, right?
Uh-huh.
And until we think about it, until we see it as a choice, it's not. And we'll roll with whatever our programming is. Now, can you see how this is relevant to how we think about ourselves, our spouse, our intimacy, our relationships? We get programmed and then we just roll with that thinking. Well, the first step that I ask my clients to do is pause, turn on your metacognition, think about your thinking for a minute. And we have to be able to discern between what our circumstances are and our thinking about those circumstances.
Gotcha.
Um, when I said circumstances are neutral, okay, I don't mean that they're painless or easy, because sometimes our circumstances are extremely painful and difficult.
Right, right. Like abuse or other things like that are horrible circumstances.
Right.
Right. You're not gonna think positively through the abuse or whatever, right?
Well, and that's why we got to get past that trite, fluffy, just think positive
Right,
stuff.
exactly.
Right. I had a powerful experience years ago, Dan, when I got to do some work with Elizabeth Smart. Now, a lot of people will remember her name still. And if you don't, you can go Google her and see what that story was at the age of 14. You talk about abuse.
That's a horrible
Okay.
story, yeah. Horrible
She's
circumstance.
abducted from her own home at the age of 14 and then severely abused for 9 months.
Yeah.
9 months before she was rescued. Okay. And I Elizabeth shared this with me. She said, at first I thought this was the worst thing that could ever happen to anybody. It was like me with my bankruptcy. And I'm thinking about Elizabeth and I'm thinking, well, that is the worst thing that could happen. Right. And she's like, yeah, that's what I was thinking. And then it got worse. And she realized, oh, well, that wasn't the worst thing. This is the worst thing. And then it got worse. But this allowed her to turn the lights on and realize it could always be worse. And so let's tie this in. Can I just tie this into a psychological principle for you? Because check it out. You are constantly judging.
Yeah.
Now
So
let that settle in for a minute.
our brains are wired to always evaluate and judge.
Yeah, you have to,
Uh-huh.
you can't turn it off. It's like gravity.
Uh-huh.
When do you get up and think, oh, I wonder if gravity's on today? It's
Right.
to be, right?
Uh-huh.
So, and this is like that. Your brain has to judge because your brain has two main jobs: to keep you safe and to prove you right.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And both of those get in our way all the time.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
But because your brain has to keep you safe, it has to constantly be scanning and being vigilant about what's going on in your world and trying to detect threat,
Right.
right?
Uh-huh.
So you're constantly judging or evaluating everything that's going on. Now, the word evaluation, this is one of those processes that I was telling you about. When you think about your thinking, notice that you're constantly judging. And the word evaluation implies comparison with some standard.
Right. You're like weighing it with this or that. Okay.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
compared to what? So I'm going through my bankruptcy and I'm thinking this is bad. Compared to what? Compared to not going through a bankruptcy,
Right. Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
When I had an opportunity to learn about that pioneer family, I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of a cakewalk.
Uh-huh.
I mean, compared to that,
Right.
what was Elizabeth doing? Compared to being safe at home with her loving family, this sucks. But compared to worse things, which she could imagine, it puts it, see what shifts here, Dan. It doesn't take away the pain. All right. It simply puts you in a different position, which is also synonymous with the word attitude, by the way.
Okay.
Attitude, you ask any pilot, attitude is an aviation term. It has to do with the position of the plane relative to the ground or the horizon.
Okay. Uh-huh.
My son's a pilot. He taught me this.
Okay.
And
Okay.
our attitude or position is what changes. And that position, what it did for Elizabeth is it gave her a feeling of gratitude while she was still in the circumstance. Okay. She felt grateful that it wasn't worse and she could imagine worse things now. She felt grateful that it wasn't worse. That gave her hope and fueled her ability to move to the next process. I told you there's two. You know what, Dan? I've made a visual model about this, and I know it's an audio podcast.
Uh-huh.
I get that. But the visual model I'm showing you as we're having this interview. There's these two processes that are going on. We're going to move to the next one, which is called creation.
Okay. And let me describe. Yeah, I see like there's an X and a Y axis if I look at it that way.
Mhm.
And on the bottom is evaluation, on the top is creation. That's like the Y axis. And then you
Yes. I
and then
think
you
you
have
know
an
what?
X
I
axis.
can do you
Uh-huh.
one better
Right,
here.
right. Uh-huh.
I will give you, anybody who's listening, I will give you a free copy of this model with a full description. It's in a mini book called Portable Positivity.
Okay.
And if you can just put the link in the show notes or something, Dan, that'll
Got
be
it.
helpful. But if
Yep.
you remember my name, Dr. Paul Jenkins, spelled with a DR, drpauljenkins.com/GYMO, which I don't know what that stands for. Dan, do you have?
Get your marriage on. Uh-huh.
Remember, John, okay? GYMO. I'll give you a free copy of this because I want you to see the visuals that we're talking about. I can describe it here verbally, but once you see the model, you're going to see how all of this ties together. See, thinking positively does not mean that we just ignore or completely write off the painfulness or the difficulty of our circumstance. It does not mean that. In fact, we are going to accept and honor that it is what it is. Okay. The bankruptcy, in fact, was a bankruptcy. Elizabeth's abduction was, in fact, an abduction with a lot of abuse that occurred. Okay. Now, is it good or bad? Depends on what you compare it to. Now, let's talk about creation for a minute. Creation is about what is to be. And that doesn't exist yet.
Okay. That's why
We
it's called
haven't created
creation.
it. Yeah. And all we can do is imagine it. Okay. Go back to evaluation for a minute. We constantly are judging our circumstances. You judge yourself pretty harshly sometimes.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And that
Yes.
matters because it affects how you feel. You judge your spouse, judge your kids, judge the people in your neighborhood, the people in your community. You judge the government. You judge the economy. You judge the weather. You're judging me.
Uh-huh.
It's cool. I'm judging you.
Uh-huh.
We can't turn it off, right?
Right.
And how we judge it affects how we feel. So I've got a trick question for you. I warned you. This is a trick question.
All right. Bring
You
it on.
How you doing in your intimacy?
Uh-huh.
Now, I
Okay.
want
Uh-huh.
you to, it's a trick question.
Uh-huh.
That's an evaluation question. And what I want you to notice is that you have an answer to that.
Yes.
Okay, now your answer to that determines how you feel about that.
Gotcha.
And I've discovered this in my practice. Maybe you've seen this as well. People in general have a hard time distinguishing between thoughts and feelings, or
Yes.
between thoughts and circumstances.
Right. So the 3 steps, it's separating circumstance from thought. That's the first step.
You see?
What are the facts versus what do I think about those facts, right? And the second step there is what are my thoughts and my feelings about those thoughts? That's another separation. That's a skill people need to learn, I think.
It is, and you can develop this skill. This is where coaching comes in handy.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Dan, I hired a new coach about 18 months ago
Uh-huh.
to coach me. Okay, I'm a professional psychologist,
Uh-huh.
and I hired a new coach to coach me. And as she was coaching me,
Uh-huh.
I was describing what was going on in my business and in my practice, and I'm giving it out. And she said this. She said, "That's a thought."
That's just a thought. Uh-huh.
No, you're not listening to me. Here's what's going on. And she's like,
That's
I'm
just a
just
thought.
saying that's your thought about what's going on. What's
Uh-huh.
going on can be described in very basic terms.
Uh-huh. Right.
Okay. My husband said this. My wife did that. Okay. That's your circumstance. Now, what you think about it determines how you're going to feel. And people miss that sometimes too. They'll say, well, I just feel like my husband doesn't understand me.
Uh-huh. That's a thought, not a
That's a
feeling.
thought.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. In fact, here's a little shortcut. Anytime you say, I feel like, whatever comes after that is a thought,
Right. Not an emotion.
not a feeling. Not a feeling. Feelings can be described with one word, sometimes two, but usually just one.
Like
And
happy,
they're
sad,
created.
frustrated,
Yes.
elated,
Deflated,
confused. Uh-huh. Right.
betrayed. Okay. So, and the feelings are caused by the thoughts.
You can't have a feeling without a thought that accompanies it.
Look, you're always right about how you feel. Can I say that again as a professional psychologist?
Yes.
You're always right about how you feel. How you feel is 100% consistent with the way your mind is doing these two processes that I've introduced to you today: evaluation or judgment of what it is, and creation of what is to be. So let's go back there for just a minute. How do you feel when you imagine? Because you don't know. I mean, check it out. How are you doing next week?
Okay. Uh-huh.
You don't know. You've got something to do with it, but you don't know. So all you can do is imagine. Now go to the feelings. When you imagine or predict or expect that what's coming is even worse than what you've already got,
Uh-huh.
how do you feel?
You feel worse.
Yeah,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
this is anxiety. Okay, that's 30 years of clinical experience in a nutshell right there. This when we feel anxious or afraid or apprehensive about what's coming, it's not because of what is. I mean, it's not here yet. Right? My marriage is just going to get worse from here. We're probably never going to be able to figure out how to enjoy sex or whatever, right? I mean, these are predictions and you don't know. But what do you feel? Anxiety. Okay? How do you feel if you imagine or predict or expect that what's coming is even better than what you've already got? How do you
Uh,
feel?
What's the opposite of anxiety?
right?
Uh-huh.
And I label this one hope,
Hope. Okay. Mm.
but it can also be excitement or anticipation or eagerness, okay, or connection or intimacy. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can feel as a result of our own thinking about it. So I've given you some of the psychology behind it, and maybe it would help to look at how this applies to some real life situations.
Okay, sure.
Can
So,
you think of some?
yeah, there's a couple I'm coaching, just to keep it short. She told him, after years of marriage that she's been faking her orgasms. Not all the time, but sometimes. And he took the news pretty hard because he
Okay.
made it mean he's not a good lover. He made it mean something about his performance.
So do you see the thought in that
Yes.
and
The
the
circumstance
judgment,
first. Let's
the
look at the
evaluation?
circumstance. Uh-huh.
Okay, the circumstance is simply the way sex is going and has been going for this couple.
Right.
That's it.
That's it. Uh-huh. Neither
That's
good nor
it.
bad. That's it.
No.
Uh-huh.
Right. In fact, it's neutral.
Yes.
Can you see that it could be worse?
Oh, yeah. It could be worse. Uh-huh. And it could be better. Right. Uh-huh.
Hey, after being a shrink for 30 years, you can't shock me. I have heard some of the darndest crap you can imagine. Okay. So I can always come up with it could always be worse. It could always be better. So how they're doing, that's their circumstance. Now, what's the thought about it?
The thought
You,
is like, it must mean I am not a good lover or
I'm not a good lover. That's a thought. That is not a circumstance. Okay. That's a thought that he's having about that. Now, how is he going to feel with that thought?
yeah, deflated, emasculated or whatever. Uh-huh.
Inadequate.
Right. Uh-huh.
Yes. Okay. Probably depressed. All right. Now, here's the thing. However we feel determines how we show up.
Right. Our actions. Right.
And what do we know about sexual enjoyment and performance and all of that? Is that tied at all to how we feel?
Sure, it does.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. So how's
Uh-huh.
he going to be showing up?
Not as enthusiastic,
Not nearly as
not
well.
as eager. Uh-huh.
Yeah. It will be harder for him. It'll be harder for her. And that creates our results. Then our results become our new circumstances. So we get into this loop and notice the piece that matters the most is the thinking. Because if we can change our thinking, it changes how we feel, which changes how we show up, which changes our results. This is the whole crux of the coaching and therapy and counseling industry is getting to the root, which is in our thinking. It's not in our circumstances.
Right. Right.
So
So
what happens if he changes that thought? Instead of I'm inadequate, what's another possible thought that could serve him and his marriage better?
um one could be, well, wife, I'm sorry to hear that. That must be totally awful that it hasn't been great for you. I hope it gets better for you.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Maybe it's not about me,
Exactly. Right.
right? Which is
Uh,
going to change how he feels. But what if we entertain a couple of other possibilities like, oh, my wife trusts me so much to share this intimate detail with me.
right. Uh-huh.
My wife loves me and trusts me and wants better things for our marriage.
Mhm.
Okay, that's just a thought
But those thoughts, generally, the ones you gave, are much better. Well, I don't know. They will yield different results. Uh-huh.
because they yield different feelings. Instead of inadequacy, now he's feeling tenderness. Huh. I wonder which of those feelings is going to help him show up better in their intimate reactions moving forward.
Yeah, which one's gonna give me the results I really want in life? Right.
Inadequacy or tenderness, right? So as we start to connect to that, now look, disclaimer, Dan, I am not here to tell people how to think. I don't have that kind of authority. I just want people to see that they are thinking and that thinking matters. And it's not just thinking. I mean, I get this from some of my colleagues sometimes. Oh, just change how you think, right?
Just
Look,
can't just thought swap all day, right?
no.
Uh-huh.
And whatever you're thinking is fine. I just want you to see that it has a predictable consequence. And if that's not serving you well, there's a choice. And it doesn't come naturally because whatever you're used to thinking, you remember I told you your brain has two jobs, to keep you safe and to
Prove
prove
you
you
right.
right.
Uh-huh.
So whatever you're already thinking, your brain wants to just hang on to and prove that that's right. Well, it doesn't mean it's right. It just means that that's what you're used to. So as you use the term thought swapping, it's not as simple as just saying, well, I'll just change out my thoughts for some other one. I think the first step is seeing that there's a choice. Well, first step. How many first steps can we have? Because we've already talked about, let's discern between circumstances and thoughts. Let's discern between thoughts and feelings. And then let's go to a level of choice, which you can create through metacognition. Think about your thinking. Notice it. You don't even have to change it. Just notice it. And that puts you back into a position of choice. Then it's choice, kind of like playing the guitar is choice.
Okay.
Okay,
All
can
right.
you choose that? Yeah.
Sure. Uh-huh.
And obviously it's a skill set. Okay, so you get to do some practice, maybe hire somebody to instruct you, spend some time and effort and probably money to reprogram your brain to be able to play the guitar. Well, it's no different in our thinking. That's why I think like your programs to coach people and to train their brain a little differently. If they choose to do that, it's totally possible. And it requires a choice and then a whole lot of reps.
Yes. This has been so helpful. I love everything you're sharing with us.
It's fun, isn't it? Getting to know how to operate the equipment of our own mind. It changes the game for everything. And not just our intimacy. I mean, that's a pretty big deal,
Uh-huh.
right?
Right. Uh-huh.
But every aspect of our relationships, our finances. Remember, I learned this originally through a bankruptcy. I mean, I got a PhD in clinical psychology. It's not nearly as powerful as what I've learned through my own life experience. And discovering these processes that I've described in my model. And that's why I want to share that with everybody too.
Great. I
So,
hope it's in the show notes. Go and download this model, this diagram. Be good.
yes. Just remember drpauljenkins.com/GYMO. Get your marriage on. GYMO. That'll take you right there. And it's just for listeners of this show to go get a copy of that.
That's good. That's generous. Thank you.
Oh,
That's
you're
good.
welcome. It's exciting, isn't it? To start seeing the possibilities that can happen when we take charge. Either you direct your thinking or your thinking will direct you.
Yeah, you could be on autopilot and just go through life kind of where the wind takes you, so to speak, mentally. Or you can really like be the pilot and really
Right.
decide where do you want to go, what thoughts you're going to think.
And either way is fine.
Mhm.
And own it. Okay.
Yes. Uh-huh.
If you're going to be on autopilot, I want you to see that as a choice. And it's the default choice, by the way. Default is what happens if you don't make a different choice.
Right. Uh-huh. Well, thank you very much. You're so wise. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with all of us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to join you here. I love the conversation.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in accelerating growth in your marriage, either sexually, emotionally, or spiritually, I want to invite you to work with me in my affordable coaching program called Next Level. More information about Next Level and my fun and sexy apps for couples are available at getyourmarriageon.com. Please also don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss a single episode. And be sure to tell your married friends. I promise, they will thank you for life. Now go get your marriage on.